Hello. Our story begins on Malachor, following the devastating battle between the Mandalorians and a new Sith regime. None of that mattered though. The Sith Triumvirate had returned to the wreckage left by the mass shadow generator. Kreia wasn't here for remembering battles or life lessons to learn. She was bringing Nihilus, Sion, and rendezvousing with Lord Revan for her own new intentions. The Force was a criminally powerful essence in the galaxy, and while she, as a practitioner of its great gifts, she found the ethics of the concept to be draining. This wasn't a gripe with the Jedi per se, more or less the Force itself. No matter what the dark side did, the light would always rise to balance it out. The Force desired a light victory because the Force itself was the light, and bound to it. Kreia recognized that regardless of what the Sith did, or for that matter any other empire did, the Force would always crush it for its own perfect galaxy. It was the reason why these cycles continued to persist. Great powers before her had risen and fallen in accordance to the will of the mystical power. The Sith controlled it more than the Jedi could ever hope to do, and yet the Sith lost every time. Maybe it wasn't an instantaneous loss, but it happened regardless of the power in the galaxy. She was here to put an end to the overbearing presence. In theory, if she could destroy the Force, then the Sith and the Jedi would fight on equal terms. No longer would the corrupt order be bailed out by the Force. They'd be left to the complete and total mercy of the Sith. And at that, Kreia recognized that the only plausible way for the natural order of events to transpire, the way that they were meant to, the Force needed to be eradicated. Nihilus and Sion were both willingly following Kreia's lead, but they had their own intentions to oust her from the Triumvirate, potentially. When Revan arrived, he showed very little interest in what she had to say about the Force. He was trying to establish his Sith Empire as the dominant power in the galaxy. The master of his own torment, Emperor Vitiate, had no clue this interaction was taking place. The four powerful beings greeted above the temple, on the flat surface that encompassed the planet, before Kreia led them down to the actual Sith temple itself. She continued to iterate her feelings and frustrations with the Force. The Triumvirate was already on her side, because they actively trusted her, but Revan wasn't nearly as likely. He still followed her, and the more Kreia spoke, the more he understood. Completely shattering the cosmic force could perhaps be the greatest gift to the Sith Empire, to him especially. He saw in this moment what he could gain from this sort of structure. An excitement ran through their bodies as they closed in on the entrance to the structure. Sion and Nihilus, per their master's instruction, raised the doors for Kreia and their guest. They walked in through the caves built by the ancients, and used the Force to cross platforms to the center of the temple. Malachor 5 was a powerful planet with a Force. Its existence was being used by the Sith for greater powers, and Kreia began the ritual, what she hoped would forever destroy the Force, and give the Sith their own righteous path towards victory. At the end of multiple hours, the galaxy shifted. The Force on Malachor reverberated through the temple, and a shockwave emitted from the planet. The four Sith rocked back and forth before falling on their backs and gripping the ground for stability. Side note, the Force in all reality should have probably killed every living being in its destruction, but since this is a story, let me cook. Shifting expanded the ground below them, and the four Sith were split from each other as their separate platforms crumbled and deteriorated. The Force sent ripples outwards as it breathed its last breath. The Sith Temple and Malachor 5, being the location of the death of the Force itself, would be the sacrifice. The planet ruptured open, and gravity slowly fell apart as Kreia, Revan, and Sion cried out. Nihilus, who relied entirely on the Force to simply exist, couldn't live without it, and he shared the least painful death of those he helped. Sion would crumble to his knees. Every death he had experienced but survived because of the Force would be experienced again, all at once, in great pain. Revan's mind control from Vitiate vanished, as he in his final moments longed for the woman he cared most about. All of it was broken, and he'd been sucked into space. with Kreia sharing a moment of ultimate clarity. By attempting to remove the influence of the Force, she killed the very thing that gave the galaxy its power. The Sith Emperor, Vitiate, fell from his throne at the other side of the galaxy, grasping for his power now leaving his essence. The Jedi inside their temple looked to others around them, wondering why they all felt so lost. The balance no longer existed. The Force was destroyed, gone, removed from existence as if it had never truly been there. The High Council reached out to members around the galaxy, and the results were all the same. For Jedi engaged in fights, they wielded their lightsabers, but their insight was gone. They may have held the extremely powerful weapons, but no longer was it any more effective than using a broadsword or a blaster. These Jedi would be killed with relative ease, and for those who served the dark side, the answer was the same. The beginning of the Age of Chaos wasn't with a sonic boom. Most of the people in the galaxy didn't realize the Force was gone, because many didn't practice it in the way the Jedi or the Sith did. For societies that relied heavily on Force sensitives, like the Doran or Chiss, they'd be the first to experience the loss of the Force and the consequences it brought everyone. The wars that were being waged could no longer be determined by foes or allies who could face an entire army alone and come out on top. No longer were there galactic heroes that could sweep opponents away with their hands. The Jedi Order, who remained connected to the Galactic Republic, reported on their lost ability and what it meant for them and their war. But it was the irony in all of this. To the general public, soldiers, and everyday people, losing the Force wasn't that important. The Guardians of the Whills knew that the Force was gone, but they now were theoretically no different than the Jedi or the Sith. These were religious sects that preyed on the Force for their answers. The difference had always been that the two rivaling religions could do something about it. So while the Jedi all reacted with shame, believing that they had failed the Force, attempted to repent. And, well, the Sith, they tore themselves apart. The inherent selfishness of the dark side wasn't just a trick of the Force, but the intent of the individual. Sith blamed themselves and each other, using their individualistic hatred to hurt those around them. So, internal fighting persisted, and without the strength of a star cruiser hidden underneath their sleeves, they were just as easy to kill as any other grunt. A lightsaber was effective, temporarily, but none of them, not Malak nor Vitiate, were safe from those who realized the power they possessed was gone. This was the nail in the side of the Sith that would see them vanish from the face of the galaxy in the Age of Chaos. But just because the Sith Order and religion would soon disappear from the face of the universe, it didn't mean that chaos wouldn't persist. As the Jedi moved into a more priestly state of existence, transforming themselves from warriors into simple monks and priestesses, the Republic moved on without them. The Jedi in their own way were trying to repent, believing that the Force existed out there somewhere, and they had to earn its favor once again. They started being more religious, pulling all warriors from the front lines and attempting to reconcile. Some Jedi would be sent to religious worlds to meditate. Others would parade their ideals of the Jedi Code and of the Force itself to others around them, as the rest of the Order attempted to remove themselves from being combative frequently. The Republic government didn't have time for this sudden shift in morality, so they moved around the Jedi and the war for the galaxy began. The Sith Empire, now without former Force sensitives, was led by warlords. The Mandalorians, now, with almost no one in their way, rebuilt their forces in the aftermath of the mass shadow generator incident over Malachor, and the Republic forced its military into action. Space battles, campaigns, and total war encompassed the galaxy. The destruction of the Force was the end of balance. Not to say that with the Force these battles wouldn't have happened, but the mysticism holding the galaxy together no longer existed. The Jedi sent representatives to plead with Mandalorians and warlords of the Sith regime to end this conflict, only for their heads to be sent back to the Jedi Temple. The Warlord Empire was too hyper-focused on the Republic initially, because so many of them had their own personal frustrations with Republic leadership. In this directed attack on the Republic, they surrendered time to an entirely warlike regime on Mandalore, and the Mandalorians would rebuild themselves. And with raging factions of galactic power taking the fight to each other, the Mandalorians would slide around the upper northeast quadrant of the galaxy. capturing territory and enlisting new troops into their ranks. The most important capture for them would be the cruiser production facility at Mon Calamari. Inversely, another faction started to rally around the Outer Rim, under the leadership of the Great Hutt Syndicate. These minor factions didn't hold a lot of power, but as the years started to slowly ease by, and planets like Alderaan faced scorched Earth, the combat for galactic dominance became a four-way war. Due to the Sith and Republic neglecting, especially the Mandalorians, the war consumed every aspect of society. Trade routes were completely cut off, people suffocated under billowing towers of smoke, food supplies were short, and the only hope to survive came by joining the military. Lines were drawn across the galactic map, and refugees looked for the only safe havens in the galaxy. Untouched planets became Mandalore, Coruscant, Korriban, and Tatooine. These systems were the most defended locations in the galaxy. The influence of the Jedi by this point was diminished almost entirely. However, it wouldn't be forever gone like the Sith. Because the Jedi weren't actively pushing people to their breaking points or limiting an entire empire's growth by targeting another religion, their position on Coruscant became one of giving hope to people. The Jedi were a religious sect at heart, but never were they needed for giving to the people. They relied on the Force and helped with their natural gifts. Without it, they had to provide something for people to put their faith into. Because the Force was gone, and with it its mysticism, the Jedi created a new religion around their own lessons of the Force. Jedi of older times were regarded for historical accuracies, and their powers, or gifts, were utilized to inspire the masses. Slowly, as the political power of the Jedi vanished, their societal importance became synonymous with the military of the Republic, a faith to rely on, a religion to trust in, as the galaxy slowly descended into a dark ages. The Age of Chaos wasn't just war, but since factions only grew more and more, and battle lines shifted so frequently, this war wouldn't be short. It would be close to nearly 100 full years of raging conflict. Entire star systems would lose populations, quadrillions would die, and resources would be expended. There would be a massive growth in technology before that all slipped away too. Hyperspace travel regressed because hyperspace routes were blockaded and cut off. Systems were forced to join their conquering forces, and the Republic, despite starting out the strongest, would soon become the weakest of the three factions around them. This 100-year galactic war, which was the beginning of the Age of Chaos, wouldn't lead instantly into an Age of Empires, but simply a prolonged chaotic time period where darkness covered the galaxy. The Sith warlord regime would remain a powerful contender in the galactic landscape, but since 100 years had passed since the deaths of Vitiate, Revan, and Kreia, motives changed. The Sith weren't pushed by a religion, it was just the most powerful to rule them all. Their hierarchy was a constant king of the hill, with various members taking power from those weaker. In all irony, even without the Sith, the ethics of their corrupt ways remained, and it became their weakening point. If a singular warlord saw too many losses, then he or she would be replaced. The cycle continued, and because Mandalorian warriors were almost untouchable without Jedi or Sith interference, they became the most dominant power in the galaxy. But that perhaps was the worst thing for everyone, including the Mandalorians. Because Mandalore was a warrior society, singularly focused on combat and machines of death, they wouldn't replace what the Republic was as a galactic government. Not to say that the Republic, or Jedi for that matter, were the best thing for the galaxy, but they were the most progressive aspect of society as a government. They brought new technology, wonders, trade routes, and everyday needs to everyone who actually needed them. They united the galaxy, and the 100-year Age of Chaos had broken all of that down. As a result, when the peacetime slowly started and the Mandalorians rose to the power structure in the galaxy, no new government would form. And despite skirmishes between the four major factions never truly ending, the Mandalorians, like the Sith warlords, would tear themselves apart from the inside out. The Republic and Hutt Syndicate had similar problems. They'd pick on themselves and destroy some minor alliances within their regimes, but nothing comparatively to the two largest warring factions of the war. The main rivalry in the galaxy became the one between the warlords and the Mandalorians, because so much of the last 100 years had been seeing who would come out on top. With both pulling back to build up their forces while trying to rebuild some of their destroyed societies, their leaderships would crumble respectively. The Dark Age of the Galaxy wasn't the first or last time it would ever happen, but it would be the longest, uninterrupted period of societal decline and technological stagnation ever seen in galactic history. This pretty much was the continuation of the Age of Chaos, and future historians would encompass the 100-Year War and the 2,500-year Dark Age that followed into one category. The Dark Ages were harrowing for generations. The lines drawn from the 100 Years' War that came before the Dark Times were more solidified than ever before. Planets that were once beautiful and would have continued growing with time were lost to time. Bestine, Naboo, Kashyyyk, Mimban, Ord Mantell, and Ithor were among dozens of other systems completely lost to time. Either their global populations were destroyed, or they migrated away to avoid destruction. The abandonment of galactic trade between different regimes destroyed balance in the galaxy. Without the fighting Jedi, the warlords and Mandalorians took over, and now, following nearly 3,000 years of crumbling societies, empires began to rise. The Sith warlords were beyond weak. Their focus on destruction left them with little population to fill their ranks. Now, only legacy members of their empire remained. These were the elites that somehow managed to survive throughout the Dark Ages. But with famine and plague, and little food or supply, the warlords were left to fight for everything. In the same way the Sith died, their regime was teetering on the edge of total destruction. The Mandalorians, despite not making any technological advancements, and also being built off a warrior society, were doing much better than the warlords. The key difference is the Mandalorians, despite being just as cruel as the Sith, sometimes even worse, recognized the importance of a united regime. So while the Dark Ages consumed the galaxy, they, like the Republic, maintained connection within its borders to survive. For each individual sect, they believed that the exterior galaxy around them had fallen apart, but no one dared to explore, in fear of potential wars starting again. The warriors that made each faction strong in the heydays of the 100-Year War were long gone. It took thousands of years to recapture that strength. There, of course, were individual conquerors and emperors or whatnot that did capture territory and explore, but they were few and far between, not to mention, like every really great ruler, they were limited not by who they were, but by who came after them. No one could ever be as great as they could be, and that was the burden for their regimes. The Republic and Hutt Syndicate were somewhere between the success and disappointment of the warlords and the Mandalorians. In the Outer Rim, the Hutts lost their influence, and they split up into various crime families, bartering for control. So while galactic scale war wasn't their position, it was within their borders. Various wars saw a new group of leadership arise from within the Outer Rim, a shadow collective referred to by their minions as the Great Eye. This newly growing empire was just in time to meet the intergalactic demand for potential change. History had been communicated within borders, and rarely did any of the former empires interact with each other. So everyone knew that a Republic, Warlord, Mandalorian, and Hutt faction existed. If they survived was a lingering question for generations, up until recently. It is also important to mention that despite the galaxy shifting into the Dark Ages, there were plagues and diseases of famine that struck entire worlds. Every regime faced it. Historians frequently wondered if these were chemicals created for war, but no one knew. The truth was a mystery to everyone. The Republic, lastly, maintained a firm connection within its borders. The edge of territory was surrounded by space stations, hyperspace mines, and fleets. Even though their military had been pretty much the weakest before the Dark Days, they boosted their military power and never really stopped. But they never did it at the expense of their people. Coruscant's population was only in the billions now, because the planet couldn't afford to hold trillions of people without intergalactic trade. So the people of Coruscant were either evicted to other Republic planets, or became rebels and retreated into Warlord, Mandalorian, or Hutt territory. Or, the other one is they joined the military. Despite the four factions preparing for first contact, there was a fifth empire that wasn't known about. The great Chiss explorers who relied solely on Skywalker children to help them navigate the unknown regions were forced to find alternative means to travel. The Chiss were able to become relatively technologically advanced in the Dark Ages, and despite them not coming into direct contact with any of the four regimes, they found the wreckages of wars long gone. The Chiss were willing to communicate if they did come into actual contact, but they also decided to unite pieces of the unknown regions and planets inside the galactic map with their own empire. The Chiss created a powerful navy, and slowly did the five empires present themselves on the galactic stage. The warlords weren't willing to come forward in fear of being targeted for being weak, but the messengers that came from the Republic stoked the flames of ingenuity and intrigue. For generations, people learned from their cultures and their regimes about the war that destroyed the galaxy. Now they all four factions, had a choice to become the greatest empires or potentially risk complete destruction. The messengers that reignited any of this were the Jedi. The religious sect based at the heart of Coruscant was the religion of the Republic. Instead of vying for political and/or militaristic power, the Jedi Order was genuinely one of priests and monks. A Grand Master nearly 1,000 years before the end of the Dark Ages disposed of every single lightsaber. The Jedi returned to preaching and spreading the word of the Force. It had been thousands of years since someone living used the Force. Now it was just a mythology that people believed in and put their faith into. Without their lightsabers, without their rivalry to the Sith, the Jedi were a cultural staple inside the Republic. Every planet was loyal to the religion of the Force and listened to the preaching of the Jedi. The temple on Coruscant was a destination for all who considered themselves Force loyal. The new name of the Jedi Temple was the Pontifex Maximus, and it was much larger. The Jedi Order consisted of over 50,000 active members on Coruscant alone, with another 130,000 members who lived inside of monasteries, temples, and places of worship across Republic territory. The rise of empires didn't start with blaster fire. Generations of idleness made Mandalorian leadership more trustworthy of the Republic. Centuries of silence made the Great Eye more open to unification with other factions. The Chiss, who had silently been maneuvering around the galaxy the entire time, were the most interested in starting alliances. For the main galaxy, history seemed to be accurate. There were four empires, now some with different names: the Chiss, the Republic, Mandalorians, and Great Eye. No one knew that the warlords were secretly and quietly watching trade routes open up and technological advancement begin. The warlords, of course, were following in their great ancestors' footsteps. They didn't start war, but they took what they could. Their vessels blended into rising trade routes, and their warriors carried out assassinations on important public officials. None of the lead governments challenged the others for complete authority over the galaxy. Regulations were created. Famines and plagues were destroyed by vaccines created by collaborative minds of the galaxy. The crime families who historically had the most active combat experience remained alert, but focused heavily on the expansion of their empire. With Kamino inside their territory, they were more willing to create military assets. Every single empire flaunted their power, not aggressively, but as a reminder of what happened before the Dark Days. This prosperity would continue for years, uninterrupted as society progressed. New medicines, food, supplies, intermingling would begin and continue. Opening up the no-go zone between regimes allowed people to explore, to see new places and meet new types of species no one knew existed or had long forgotten. The Warlord faction eventually, though, showed itself, not as a warring type, but as what many people came to assume as the fifth faction in the galaxy. No one wanted full-out conflict, and governments were accepting of what they considered to be a new faction. The warlords knew the truth. They knew what they were. They were warriors, but their territory was suffering. Their people were on the brink of betraying the ruling class. They couldn't afford all-out war with the galaxy. They were still welcomed into trade relations, though. Over star systems that had been abandoned or destroyed, new trading depots were created. Warships from every faction were present, as were permitted in the treaties. It assured that the galaxy wouldn't go back in the total war, because if someone betrayed them, then all of them would suffer. These years of trade and technological advancement saw the new golden age of the galaxy fall upon its people. every empire genuinely grew, even the warlord regime. They may have been the smallest, but at least having something gave their people hope. This was seen across the galaxy. There were regulations, and as the years went by, they would intensify, but no one would drastically attack the intergalactic market. It'd be foolish, and it would impact everyone. Centuries of life had been filled with paranoia, only for a decade to undo all of that fear-mongering. As goes the generational game of changing perception, the warlike factions rescinded their military growth. There were still individual focuses on militaristic technology. For example, the Mandalorians were unstoppable with their Beskar armor. They had reached the pinnacle of military power during the Dark Ages. When they interacted with other factions, they displayed weakness. Their forefathers would have scolded them for it, but the Mandalorians of the early 1100s weren't going to be showing their hand. The Republic displayed a little more of what they had, same with the Great Eye. The Chiss were relatively happy to just be there, and the warlords, who went by the name Sith, didn't have much to show off. Most of the Sith faction wasn't rooted in the ancient religion. The reason using Sith didn't matter is because that word was pretty much lost to the rest of the galaxy. It only resurfaced because there was a descendant of a powerful Sith warlord family. The name Sith itself became more of a family name, so unlike the other factions, the Sith was a faction family name, as in, the individual was seen as the monarch of the family, the name, and the regime. To the people that served and lived under the warlord sect, they didn't view their monarch as a monarch, but they allowed him to be a representative of their people, because the name Sith was more fitting than warlord, for example. Prosperity engulfed the galaxy for 300 years. There wouldn't be major conflict, nothing large enough to upset the cosmic balance. But of course, there always had to be one individual, someone who couldn't leave well enough alone. There was some stagnation of technological advancement, and even a slowdown in economic growth, but nothing really called for the actions of the Republic Chancellor, who tried to take control over trade. The Republic had, arguably, the most influence. This came from the Jedi religion. Ever since the opening of the trade lanes, Jedi missionaries went to every different empire. In this, the religion became more present around the galaxy. Thanks in part to the insane size of the religion, there were hundreds of thousands of messengers visible everywhere. The other empires didn't necessarily care, because none of them had truly adopted a fully regime-wide religion. The Jedi also weren't representing the Republic, they were just a religious body. The closest thing to a religion anywhere else in the galaxy was the Mandalorian way, which was integral to the life within every system of their empire. But it wasn't religious per se. It wasn't like the Children of the Watch, more like the Sundari-led regime. It was loyalty to the warrior way, not the bizarre someone can't remove their helmet because another person said so thing. Ironically, despite it being against their ancestors' way of life, the Jedi Force religion would become a staple of the Mandalorian society. Even with the new Chancellor of the Republic attempting to take control over trade for himself, the Mandalorians became loyal to the Force. The rise of empires saw society expand and grow. Factions started to prove themselves as definable allies. Generations and centuries of rebuilding brought the galaxy together, unlike seen in the history of the galaxy. But there eventually is the one weak person who just can't help themselves. With the galaxy thriving, a war on intergalactic commerce started. It turned factions against the Republic, and interrupted trade routes. The Republic flaunted its warships even more, and discussions took place between the Great Eye and the Chiss. The Outer Rim faction and Chiss were able to find common ground, and they explored alternative routes of trade without the involvement of the Republic. This also started with the Mandalorians behind the Republic's back. The Sith, in desperate need of support, surrendered most of their territory to the Great Eye, and the rest to the Chiss, as the Sith name, once again, was drowned out by another powerful regime. This time, though, being completely forgotten to time and history. After 10 years of political and societal bickering, the first shots were fired from the Republic. Many of the trade routes between the major factions continued, but the Chancellor, opting for more control inside his own government, pushed too hard. The irony is, the Chancellor thought he did well. The Republic controlled all the major trade lanes that he knew about. but due to the technological advancements, there were new trade ports opened up away from the Republic. Problematically, these new stations were either in or out of individual Empire territory. So, for example, the Great Eye had 3 major ports within their region. The Mandalorians and Chiss both had 4. The Republic didn't know about these ports. Their Chancellor paraded victory, and then he realized that he meant nothing to anyone else. Naturally, the Chancellor challenged the Mandalorians, and they weren't very enthusiastic about that. The first major battles during the Imperial era were in neutral territory, around the trade routes. The Chiss and Great Eye, despite making a trade agreement with the Mandalorians, didn't participate in the war. They instead split the warlord territory down the middle and took a piece for themselves, as they spread out their military assets to protect themselves. The Mandalorian and Republic War, as it would later become known as, would be grueling. The Republic had a much more formidable fleet and military. They spent years making it larger, but there were far more Mandalorian Imperial citizens who knew how to fight, because it was integrated into their culture regime-wide. 3 years of conflict would rock the galaxy. The Mando-Republic War divided the galaxy, and turned people against the Republic itself. The Chiss and Great Eye continued to grow in the meantime. The Mandalorians won the war, by encroaching on Republic territory and cutting them off from the major trade routes in the galaxy. As a result, the Republic would lose access to intergalactic trade with anyone else, unless they paid a fine to the Mandalorians. They were stuck in an unfavorable position, but there were little to no tensions between the Mando Empire and the other 2 regimes. The Mandalorians also refused and wrote into their constitution that they wouldn't impose payments on the other empires who traded with the Republic. They only charged the Republic for the war they started against them. So, if the Republic traded, it had to go through Mandalorian ships, it got taxed, and then sent to anyone else. The Mandalorians also refused and wrote into their constitution that they wouldn't impose payments on any of the other empires who traded with the Republic. It was a one-way deal. The Mandalorians were only charging the Republic for the war they started against the galaxy. The rise of empires never really stopped, except for the Republic. The other major factions continued to expand, though, like before, generations changed the perspective of the galaxy. The galactic religion was now the Jedi Force sect, with well over 100 million priests, priestesses, and so forth. This sect had millions of visitors on Coruscant to see the great temple of the Pontifex Maximus every cycle. But that wasn't enough of a saving grace for the Republic. The individual Chancellor had done irreparable damage to Republic regime reputation, that the other empires were overly cautious of them because of. However, as the years and eventually centuries went by, these precautions became more hostile. The Republic couldn't really do much because it had become clear that there were too many resources and technological advancements from the rest of the galaxy to just cut them off. The Republic needed to be a part of the trade and intergalactic commerce. The Chiss were perhaps, and ironically, the most forgiving faction in all of this. They didn't view or treat the Republic with as much hostility as the other 2 groups. See, with centuries of precautions against the Republic becoming common in other regions, it slowly became more acceptable to use the Republic as a punching bag. If things weren't going right domestically, more legislation would be collectively passed on the galactic level to impact the Republic specifically. It'd be mimicked by the other factions. This didn't mean the Republic was allowing it to happen, they just didn't show that vocally, because they had their own response, one that started nearly 2 centuries before the hero of the Republic was ever born. Despite peace reigning and the galaxy becoming more complacent, there was still reserved aggression. The Republic was treated like the big bad wolf. No one openly did business with them in spite of their ancestors. Their punishments weren't really meant to last for generations. The original officials who started this didn't fully recognize what generations of neglect could do to a people. The Jedi often helped coax protesters and rioters who wanted to declare independence from intergalactic trade, but it never really got anyone anywhere. So with the galactic community teaming up on the Republic, an individual needed to change that. A man who would have been known for his cunning hatred and brutality wouldn't be so different. But without the Force, he wouldn't be drawn into the corners of darkness. Palpatine's hatred didn't come from nothing. Aside from a strained relationship with his father, it came from those who imposed their own restrictions and abuse on the Republic. Palpatine was not a politician, and his people had survived since the Dark Days because they immigrated from Naboo before society collapsed and plague wiped out the remaining population. His forefathers settled on Kreia before his parents moved to Coruscant. They were shipbuilders on Kreia, and now they were a part of the underground military on Coruscant. Thanks in part to generations of suffering, the Republic was planning to respond in its own way. The Mando-Republic War was terrible, and the galaxy agreed, but how many generations of quadrillions needed to pay for the work of one man? Palpatine had his own thoughts on the politics of it all, but he was more concerned with the freedom of his people. Without the Force and completely hating the religious sect of the Jedi, Palpatine was pulled into the military. He learned from a young age and was pushed to be a fighter by his father. Whether it was the abuse he faced or the grit his father imparted onto him, he was a product of a machine hell-bent on revenge. The Mandalorians, Great Eye, and Chiss had gone too far. Before the year 50 BBY, Palpatine accompanied his mother, whose aunt was a diplomat to the Chiss capital. He would learn an appreciation for the blue-skinned aliens during this, and come to respect their attention to detail and disagreement on a societal level of the Mandalorian response, which had overstayed its welcome in the galactic community. As a young man, Palpatine trained and ascended to the ranks, and when the year 50 BBY came around, he served as a naval officer and admiral of the Republic. Because of the Mandalorian tax, the Republic resorted to multiple centuries of military creation in secrecy. Warships, blasters, weapons to counter the Mandalorians. For years, as the galaxy idly enjoyed peace and imperial prosperity, and the Mandalorians profited off Republic trade, they waited with vengeance in their hearts. People suffered because of it. The Republic economy fell behind, and then the first shots were fired. The Mandalorians, inversely, had gone through with another generational shift. They were prideful warriors again. They had risen and fallen and risen since the fight with the Republic. Perhaps there was an extra important focus because of their tax on Republic trade, and as a result, two factions opened up the gates to war. The rise of empires was finally over. This was a fight the Great Eye and the Chiss knew was coming for a while. However, there was a surprising divide that hit the middle of the Chiss and Great Eye relationship. Where the Chiss pitied the Republic and wished them well, even after their past mistakes, the Great Eye, decades before, made a pact to take a small percentage of the tax cut, if they were willing to stand against the Republic if they attacked Mandalore. Essentially, the Great Eye took 35% of all the taxes the Mandalorians took from the Republic. In exchange, if the Republic ever attacked, the Great Eye would support the Mandalorians in combat. This for the Mando Empire wasn't out of fear of militaristic inadequacy, but to protect their people. If the Great Eye could suck up more death than them, then it was a worthwhile investment. The war started, and the Chiss, after generations and centuries of unity, broke their alliance with the Great Eye. They would have remained aligned if the Great Eye didn't attack the Republic, but war had returned to the galaxy, and the Chiss didn't want to participate. Palpatine, despite rising through the ranks, was not on the front lines. He remained in the Coruscant Undercity. The reason the Republic was able to so effectively build their military without anyone seeing or noticing was because of the underworld. Due to the mass exodus centuries before during the Dark Ages, there was a ton of extra unused space under Coruscant. The materials were broken down and shifted into a shipyard. It helped the Republic create new jobs to counter the Mandalorian taxes since the Mando-Republic War. The war was an unexpected move from the Republic, because they'd been so dormant for so long, but it was forceful, and the Mandalorians lost the first few battles against known-about Republic vessels and fleets. Then, the Republic was crushed by a counter-move. The Republic vessels below Coruscant hid, and they kept on building. They didn't show themselves until after the fourth largest Republic fleet was clobbered in a combined assault from the Great Eye and the Mandalorians. Despite continuing to participate in hidden trade with the other major empires, the Chiss decided to do the same with the Republic, opening up 3 new trading outposts to assert their neutrality. They were still peacefully in line with the Great Eye, despite not formally holding an alliance, but they wanted to play everything to best suit themselves. The Chiss were the only established empire in the galaxy that maintained neutrality and continued the trade with every major faction after the war started. Sometimes the Mandalorians and Great Eye would trade materials that would just end up going to Republic territory through trades with the Chiss. though unlike the 3-year war between the Republic and Mandalorians, this one would continue for decades. Palpatine's presence was a saving grace for the Republic. His first battle would be at one of the multiple century-old trading outposts. With an outnumbered fleet and the Republic supply lines in peril, he gathered a small fleet and crushed through the combined opponents. 3 years into the war, the Mandalorians and the Great Eye, who stopped winning battles, would force an ultimatum against the Chiss. Leadership from the Great Eye learned of the behind-the-back trading done between the Chiss and the Republic, so they threatened the Chiss, which they didn't really appreciate. The ultimatum was to leave the Republic behind and no harm would come to them. But an up-and-coming admiral for the Chiss had no intention to take that threat with kindness. The Chiss wouldn't respond to the demand. Instead, they would blindside the Mandalorian Empire. Truth be told, the Mando Great Eye Alliance never thought the Chiss would pick sides, especially not the Republic, because they had remained the only non-combative empire since the Dark Days. But the back-ending by the Chiss would have a complete shift on the war. With Palpatine becoming a hero of the Republic, the Chiss were the masterminds of a little-known move called the Master Flank. They moved through the upper northeast, due to their historical navigators understanding the galactic map. They smacked a number of planets without defenses, including especially important shipyards at Mon Cala. They didn't keep their fleets behind, because that would be pointless, but they utilized this to completely shift the Mandalorian defense. The Great Eye was on the complete other side of the galaxy, so they weren't going to be easy to hit for the Chiss. But the Chiss also utilized old warlord territory to make a trench line across a number of systems to defend themselves. The trade lanes slowed, and the important contributors to trade in this war were the two aligning factions with each other. Combat raged on and on. The Jedi tried to unite the people, but some outlandish radicals would attempt to squash Republic morale by executing Jedi missionaries. It turned some people against the war, but nothing would really stop the conflict. Similar to the Galactic 100-Year War 3,000 years before, history repeated itself here. Peace treaties didn't come. The Republic, the current generation at least, had experienced hardships as a result of a war no one was alive to see. Even though the Mandalorians felt they had a right to their punishment of the Republic for something centuries old, they were also too headstrong and defiant to surrender to the Republic. It would either be a ceasefire and peace treaty or nothing, but the Republic didn't really slow down. With Palpatine at the helm of the Republic military, he continuously found success and protected his supply lines, forcing the Great Eye to back down. The Mandalorians were a given, they wouldn't ever surrender. The people of the Chiss Republic faction knew that, but the Great Eye was different. They were militaristically capable, but they didn't have the formidable technology or readily available forces to maintain combat for a long period of time. Unlike the Mandalorians, who shifted from military aggressive to not back to military aggressive, the Great Eye stagnated long ago. Palpatine, as a result, split the trade route between the Great Eye and the Mandalorian Empire around 14 years into the war. It would take another full 3 years of conflict for the Great Eye to slow down. Palpatine, despite not being a Sith Lord or having the Force, had the foresight, patience, and understanding to masterfully craft a campaign to destroy his rivals. Without a love life at home, or truly anyone beside himself and his life, he could determine the fate of the galaxy. He wasn't fighting for absolute control over the Republic. He wasn't trying to become Chancellor. He was a man pressed for honor. The Chiss respected him as the face of their movement, and he, despite not being a spiritual man, utilized faith to motivate his men. They were warriors of the Force, and with the Force at their backs, no one could stop them. Palpatine and Thrawn also got along quite well, but their approach to combat was varying. They both understood the hunt, and they perfected it with each other. One couldn't really call them friends, but they certainly were masterful together. Thrawn, in accordance to Republic strategy, peppered the western flank, forcing the Great Eye to pull forces from the center line to defend their capital at Tatooine. This allowed Palpatine's Republic force to plant themselves between the Great Eye and the Mandalorians, and they eventually surrendered. The Great Eye would be spared because even though Palpatine was the same man, he was proving to the galaxy that the Republic wouldn't ever be so insidious. See what I did there? The Mandalorians didn't lose support though. The most vocal supporters of the Mandalorian conflict from Great Eye territory took what starships and troops they could muster and entered into Mandalorian territory. The Great Eye also suffered a lot because they killed off Jedi missionaries, which their population didn't approve of. Following this victory, the war would stagnate for a bit. There would be many discussions between the Republic and Chiss regarding the capture of Great Eye territory, but they also needed to reframe their battle strategy. Palpatine played the long game to force the Great Eye out of the war. Now he needed time to conjure up a strategy for the Mandalorian Empire. Despite what he wanted, and that was taking his time, the Mandalorians pushed back. The Chiss protected both the northern and southern flanks, and this Mando pushback propelled the Great Eye into war for another year before they lost again. The war would become very standoffish from this point forward. Much of Mandalorian culture, which had been built up over the last 3,000 years, was keeping them in this fight. It was just the fact that the Republic had been building a larger fleet for centuries, and they were still doing it without relenting, because they wanted to be treated fairly. Even though there were calls for surrender, the Mandalorians refused to let their pride suffer that critical blow. The worst part is, they were kind of encouraged to be stubborn, because every time the Republic offered them a chance, the Mandalorians would win a lopsided victory against the Republic or the Chiss, but then the sieges and campaigns would continue without going anywhere. Due to the internal success and building of the Mandalorian Empire prior to the first Mando-Republic War, the Mandalorians were able to rely heavily on their internal support to stay economically afloat. Unlike the 100 Years' War from eons past that affected every facet of society, this war was not that, and that would be proven at the culmination of the conflict. The Mandalorians, after a few more decades, would be pushed backwards, and at a military superstructure built during the conflict at Yavin, the war would come to a conclusion. The space station had massive turbo lasers, and basically acted as a stationary fleet. The Great Eye and Mandalorians built it, in hopes to lure Palpatine into a final battle and kill him. But the nearly 70-year-old Admiral, grizzled from fighting wars his entire life, dove in headfirst, without the Chiss, and without reinforcements. This was meant to be the final battle to stop the Republic assault, but Thrawn encircled Mandalore and captured it before Palpatine even fired his first shot. The Admiral, though, fought off the Mandalorian and Great Eye fleet. Despite being outnumbered 10-1, Palpatine was able to work through defenses and masterfully outmaneuver his opponent. When the dust settled over Yavin, his fleet was in shambles, but they had survived, and that was a true cost of war. The surrender finally came, but like he did with the Great Eye, there would not be total punishments. Palpatine, after fighting for years and filled with cynicism, was not here to enslave the galaxy. He won his war. He defeated monstrous fleets and opponents of all factions that opposed him, but his terms were mutual alliance. There would be grudges felt by the enemies of the Republic, but more than anything, the man who refused to align with the Jedi religion or bring harm down on his opponents brought peace to the galaxy. In an era long before the Force was destroyed, one might say Palpatine brought balance to the Force, but there was so much work to still be done. The Republic would continue to secretly militarize, but as written by the current Chancellor, they would not be used for repression. The government vowed to itself and its former allies that they didn't want revenge, they wanted fairness. It was ironic, because all of it started with one man, hell-bent on proving himself to be the wisest of his peers. It all, however, ended with a man that refused to be boastful, someone who showed exuberant humility, and a man who would forever be known as the hero of the Republic. And that, my friends, is a twisted story. Special thanks to all the patrons for supporting the channel. Smash that like button. Let's talk about this story. So this story is really convoluted, and I felt that the only way to do this would be like a huge historical overview. This video is kind of just like, it's like a history book. It's just like rewriting all of Star Wars. As I said in the video, theoretically, I think if the Force was just removed, the galaxy should technically be destroyed. But because this is a video and a story, and that would just be like 2 seconds long, and that'd be kind of boring. And so I kind of wanted to just do this huge telling of Star Wars, the story. Theoretically, without the Force, it just becomes a sci-fi and less of a fantasy. And so that was kind of incorporated into the story. I really wanted to divide it into 3 different specific eras, so that we could focus on different aspects of what life would be like without the Force. And the thing I really wanted to suggest is that the galaxy would kind of crumble, without it fully destroying the galaxy, without the Force, there wouldn't be any balance to be had, which is why there's a 100-year war followed by pretty much 2,500 years of just darkness, which is the Dark Ages for the galaxy. I really wanted that to be like almost the punishment towards the galaxy, that they destroy themselves and then they just close themselves off from the rest of society, and a Dark Ages happens. As for like the buildup of society and then the Golden Age filled with the Mando Republic War and then eventually the rise of Palpatine, I wanted that all to be kind of like an echo of like the High Republic, late Old Republic period, where there's still empires, there's still kind of building, but I didn't want to just do, oh, the Republic exists. This is not like the galaxy doesn't unite under one banner. It's like 4 factions, all of them are equally as militarily strong. And it's really like a history book. This is what this story really is. You know, like for example, those conquerors and so forth, they're like Henry V or something like that. They're people that do really good. They go really far, and then like their son just doesn't do it, or their heir just doesn't do it, you know what I mean? The thing I wanted to do with Palpatine and the Chancellor who started the Republic Mando War is basically who Palpatine is in the actual Star Wars. I really wanted this parallel though with Palpatine and that Chancellor from the Mando Republic War era, is that individual would rise at some point. However, I really do like working with Palpatine as a hero. I think he's an interesting character as a hero, and without the Force, I mean, he just wouldn't have what it takes to go down that path, to total darkness, that is. And I really wanted to have this Chancellor figure that Palpatine would try and not be like. He's not going for political power, he's going for fairness. He's fighting for his people, for like honor, exactly. For honor, specifically. So I hope you all enjoyed this story. It was much different tonally and in scape, but if you like it, I might do more like this, so let me know. Otherwise, I love you all, spread the love, and always remember, my friends, may the Force be with you.